Listeners, law firm innovation has been an ongoing topic in the U.S. for several years. Well, today, Howard and I had the pleasure of speaking with a seasoned UK law firm executive, now advisor. We discussed Neville's contract attorney company, which he helped build and sell, plus the contract legal services company that he just recently helped his UK law firm client, Mishcon de Reya, buy. We discussed the UK legal market, private equity, and more. Enjoy. So, welcome, Neville, to the Future is Bright podcast. It's great to have you on the show.
Thanks very much, Chris. Delighted to be here. Nice to see you as well, Howard.
Good to see you, Neville.
Neville, if you could just take a couple moments, share a little bit with our audience what you're up to, a little bit of your background, that'd be great.
Yes, of course. Chris, I grew up in South Africa, qualified there as a corporate lawyer. Came to London initially to do a master's at the London School of Economics. Joined a law firm which was then called Bourbon Leighton in their corporate finance department. And then towards the end of the 90s, got into law firm management. I ended up spending around 33 years at the same firm.
Wow.
But towards the end of that, mainly focused on special projects in the innovation arena. And more recently, I've joined Mishcon de Reya, where I'm working on their innovation strategy and their alternative legal services strategy.
That's exciting. And how do you two know each other? How you, Howard, and you guys know each other?
Well, we worked together at Bourbon Leighton Paisner, although I think when we first started working together, it was still called Bourbon Leighton. And the first major thing we did together was a strategic review of the firm in the late 90s, which I'm very pleased to say the firm adopted. I think Howard must have spent the best part of 6 months wandering around the firm, talking to partners, writing up the strategy, which I still look at every now and again, Howard. You might be pleased or horrified to hear that, but I have still got that document. But then I became managing partner very shortly after that strategy was approved by the partners of the firm. And then Howard and I continued to work together on some execution of the strategy. And then the next very exciting project that Howard was involved with was a joint venture which we set up together with Deloitte called Be Professional, which was a digital online service in the employment law space. Very innovative for its time, perhaps slightly ahead of its time, but that was a very exciting project, and I certainly learned a lot from it. And hopefully Howard had a enjoyable experience running that business as well.
Yeah, I was so again, very collaborative process working with Neville for many, many years. Really enjoyed my time, and I also enjoy my time more so now that Neville's kind of at Mishcon and doing other things in the marketplace.
So, share a little bit more about Mishcon. What exactly are you exploring or working on in regards to innovation, strategy, things like that?
Well, Mishcon de Reya is a very interesting law firm and has been engaged in innovative activity for many years, both in terms of exploring new technologies and new processes for innovating the way lawyers work in their traditional advisory work for clients, but also in experimenting with a range of adjacent businesses which they've set up over time. So my work here has been less to do with innovating in the way lawyers do their traditional work for clients and more in relation to adjacent business lines on the side. And that work led the firm to acquire a business called Flex Legal, which is an interim staffing business based in the UK. A very exciting, very interesting entrepreneurial business with a very strong sense of purpose and social mobility programs. So since that acquisition completed at the end of last year, I've spent a lot of time working together with Flex and uh, figuring out how it moves on to even greater things as part of the Mishcon ecosystem.
And when you say flex and you say uh, staffing, are we talking lawyers? Are we talking other kinds of services within their client base? What exactly are they providing?
Well, Flex Legal has three business lines. The first is lawyers, which you correctly identify, so qualified lawyers. But they originally started their business with paralegals, and Flex is probably the market leader in providing interim paralegals to law firms and in-house legal departments of big and medium-sized enterprises. But their newest business line, which in many ways is particularly exciting, is that they now provide trainees uh, to in-house legal departments of big companies so they can complete their training contracts and qualify as lawyers. Here in the UK, unlike the US, before one can become fully qualified as a lawyer, one needs to complete a 2-year training contract. And competition for those places is very high. So this particular program is intended to provide opportunities for people from socially diverse backgrounds, perhaps haven't had the same opportunities as others in life to uh, become qualified as lawyers. It gives them opportunities to complete their training contracts in big companies in their in-house legal departments. It's hugely successful and the fastest growing business line within Flex at the moment. Speaking of flexible legal staffing, one of the reasons I'm particularly excited to be working with Flex Legal is because at Berwin Leighton Paisner, my former law firm, we set up in 2007 a business called Lawyers on Demand.
Okay.
And the reason we set up that business was because it was in the early stages of the global financial crisis. And lots of our clients were asking us for secondments. Money was tight. In-house legal departments had a huge amount of work to do. They didn't have enough resource. So they were asking the law firms that they tended to use for extra resource. And sometimes we could help, but often we couldn't. So a few bright sparks in the firm came up with this idea that if we could curate a small pool of half a dozen lawyers who were happy to work on a freelance basis, then at least when we were unable to offer a client a secondee, we could offer them one of these lawyers instead. And slightly to our surprise, the initial half dozen lawyers were immediately snapped up by some of our biggest clients. So the pool gradually grew. And then we had a particular light bulb moment when we realized that the firm itself could dip into this pool of freelance lawyers if we had particular spikes of activity in departments of our firm. And that business grew and grew. Eventually, I think it was 2011, we transferred it into a separate legal entity outside the firm. And then eventually in 2018, we sold it to private equity, and it was recently sold to Concilio at the beginning of the year. So, in a sense, having experienced the journey and the growth of Lawyers on Demand, it's particularly pleasing and exciting for me to have the opportunity to work together again with another of these businesses, Flex Legal.
So, Neville, I'm curious because you've been at the vanguard of kind of innovation within legal services from the very beginning. And I'm curious with your kind of experience creating lawyers on demand and now obviously with Flex Legal, do you find it's getting easier to kind of get partner buy-in to do these kind of wonderful kind of ventures that might spin off from the firm, or is it just still slow going in the marketplace because you're dealing with lawyers?
I think in some respects it's easier because there's a wider understanding and appreciation of some of these more innovative activities, let's call them, within the legal sector. And I think partners generally have a better sense of the fact that clients place a fairly high value on having access to these kind of services, and they can see that there's a sort of a value add, and it helps to keep client relationships more sticky. So in that sense, I think it's easier. But at the end of the day, partners are still pretty focused on the traditional model, which continues to serve law firms extremely well. I mean, just in the last few days, the PwC published its annual law firm survey, and it was really, some of the headlines from that report are really quite extraordinary. Over half of the top 50 law firms had double-digit revenue growth last year. 81% of the top 100, according to PwC's survey, 81% of the top 100 increased their profit last year. So if one looks at the sort of top end of the legal profession in the UK, traditional law firms are performing better than ever. They're growing fast, they're improving their profitability. So against that backdrop, it is still quite challenging to convince partners of the need for change, or indeed the value of spending money on doing things differently when the traditional model is still serving them incredibly well.
And do you think that's at the point in where we are in the marketplace? And do you think that's going to change, or is that still part of just the infrastructure of law firm life and the how the markets are performing?
Now, I think it'll be very interesting to see whether Gen AI changes the dynamic and puts some additional pressure on the traditional law firm model. And in that context, I was really interested to read again in the PwC report that the top 10 law firms in the UK generally regard Gen AI as likely to have a positive impact on their firms, in particular because they see the opportunity for productivity gains. But the rest of the top 100, so the 90 firms below the top 10, have exactly the opposite, almost exactly the opposite view of the impact of Gen AI, in that they have significant concerns about the pressure that it might produce from clients to reduce cost of legal services, and also that there may be a reduction in some of the work that's outsourced to their firms as a result of increased automation and deployment of Gen AI in corporate legal departments. So I guess, we're still at the early stages of seeing what does or doesn't happen as a result of Gen AI. But that might well begin to change the dynamic a bit and create the conditions for more rapid disruption. We shall see.
I'm curious, Neville. You brought up private equity, where Lawyers on Demand was eventually sold to. How is that playing a part in what you guys are working on for entrepreneurial ventures in the UK? Curious.
Well, it's really, really interesting because there have, of course, been investments by private equity into the legal sector. I wouldn't say there've been a huge number of them, and so far they've tended to be at the smaller end of the market. And I guess certainly in some of those investments have been with firms where their services tend to be mainly targeted at the consumer market rather than the business or corporate or institutional market. But having said that, of course, the there was an investment by Inflection in DWF last year, which is the biggest investment in a more traditional type of law firm by private equity, and that may well signal a change in the market. In that, I would imagine that would prompt other law firms of that scale and quality to begin to think more seriously about the opportunity of private equity. And there have been a number of, as I said, a number of other investments, and in fact, one of the key challenges, and we can explore some of the challenges both from the law firm side but also from the private equity side. But one of the tricky challenges, of course, is how does one achieve an exit? So if a private equity firm were to make an investment which results in a minority share of a law firm, where and when does the exit come? But in fact, earlier this year, there was an exit by Living Bridge, who had invested in a firm called Stowe Family Law, and they sold that business to Investcorp. And I think that begins to show the beginnings of a full cycle, if you like, private equity cycle, all of which I think is helpful.
And Neville, if you were kind of going, if you were to kind of view the marketplace over the next 5 years and had a kind of a crystal ball view, where do you think that private equity, where do you think private equity is going to be prevalent or not prevalent in the next 5 years?
It's always very dangerous to respond to a crystal ball question, isn't it, Howard? But I would. So I guess firstly I would say that based on my conversations with the private equity world, where there's a high degree of interest in investing in the legal sector, so I think it's a very attractive sector to private equity, and they are continually searching for opportunities to deploy capital into the sector. So based on that, and based on the fact that there have been some successful investments made so far, I would expect certainly the interest on the part of the private equity community to continue to grow. And I think we will see more examples of private equity investments into law firms. But I think initially, certainly in the early stage of that 5-year look forward, more likely to be limited to the smaller to mid-sized end of the market rather than at the larger mid-market and the biggest law firms. The other point to make, though, of course, is that the UK is a deregulated legal market, and lots of activity that was previously the preserve of law firms before deregulation can now be conducted by companies and businesses that are not regulated law firms. Those are businesses like any other businesses, and many of them have benefited from private equity investment and continue to do so. So it's not only, so when thinking about the opportunities for private equity to invest in legal, it's one has to sort of think of both communities of provider, if you like. And I think there will be continued growth in the alternative legal service provider market, presenting a growing number of opportunities for private equity and other investors in the sector.
That's why Chris and I were looking forward to speaking with you today, because I think, you represent a marketplace that's in effect almost working in the future because of there's no restrictions like we have in the US on the legal system. And so was wondering, as part of that, potential future, what kind of keeps you up at night with that? Because you have a lot of, you're just dealing with the different types of issues that we're not dealing with here in the US. And what do you think of that?
Well, firstly, just to bear in mind that there are still some restrictions. Not all legal activities have been deregulated. So, for example, representing clients in court, and that still needs to be handled by qualified, registered lawyers. But So I think the most, notwithstanding the deregulation, there is still. It appears to me from my conversations with clients, there is still a disconnect between the demand side and the supply side in the market. So when it comes to complex legal advisory support, when I speak to clients, they say to me, on the whole, they're happy with what the market offers. There are plenty of good law firms out there, plenty of good lawyers, easy to switch if they want to. And yes, it's a bit expensive, but on the whole, they're prepared to pay the money because the issues that they need help with tend to be quite important for their businesses. But when it comes to more routine legal work, and more than half of legal activity, in my experience, falls into the routine bucket, and it's a growing bucket because as technology advances, what one could define as routine expands. When it comes to routine legal work, on the whole, clients have said to me that almost nothing in the market gives them exactly what they want. And that's because the various offerings available to them from law firms, from independent alternative legal service providers, none of them have achieved the breadth, the scale, the reputation for absolute quality that the buyers of legal services have come to enjoy from traditional law firms. And I find that disconnect. That's what sort of concerns me, and in a way, it's that which sort of drives me to try and constantly find the formula which would break through and try and find how one might put together something which can really scale in order to meet the demand in the market that I come across almost on a daily basis.
Because I know in the U.S. there's a lot of people looking at that end of the marketplace from a social access to social justice perspective, where it's just too costly to engage a lawyer or a law firm for a lot of people, and they're priced out in the marketplace. And so, if you think about scale, technology, private equity, those are really interesting kind of ingredients that would fuel that kind of direction and maybe solve that in a different way than it's been solved currently. So I guess it's watch this space, but it sounds and it feels like something's about to change in the marketplace more maybe medium term, but it's definitely going to change in some shape, way, or form probably.
I think the social justice point is a really, really important point, particularly for the consumer market. And in the consumer market, we've seen considerable change. And so, for example, certainly in the UK, and I suspect in the US as well, there are businesses out there that provide people with wills, with support in a whole range of sort of family legal processes, divorce, prenup agreements, etc., where I think access to not just legal advice, but legal precedents, self-serve documents, etc., are now far more widely available. And, I think that is a significant step forward in making, in sort of making access to legally rigorous documentation and processes more widely available to the consumer market. Where there's been less success is with litigation in the courts, where the cost of litigation is still prohibitive for most people. And I'm not sure there's been a similar advance made in achieving access to justice in disputes and litigation. A lot of work has gone into that, but I guess more work is required in order to achieve some useful results.
Neville, to pivot a little bit, would love to hear some of your thoughts on the U.S. legal market entering your market and some of the influence that's taking place and competition that's being created by U.S. law firms, maybe even other jurisdictions that are also coming into your market. You mentioned South Africa, parts of South America, South Asia, Australia. I know there's organizations getting bigger. We have big law. We have big accounting. Yeah, there's a lot of competition, it seems.
Yes, the UK market is very competitive. I think as a backdrop to answering your question about the impact of US law firms in particular in the UK market, because there have been a number of law firms from other countries, Spain, the Nordics, Germany, that have opened small offices in the UK, but by far the biggest impact has been from US law firms. But just before I get on to that, I think one has to bear in mind that the UK law firms were pioneers really in building multinational law firms and started the process of expanding around the world a long time ago. And I think that has, to a degree, helped them weather the impact of US law firms coming into the market, because undoubtedly it's changed, particularly at the elite end, but also the sort of bigger mid-tier firms. It's had a very high degree of impact. And that's in a range of areas. So salaries is one. The elite American firms pay more than the UK firms do, and that's put a lot of pressure. And it's made it harder for the UK law firms to keep their talent. It's also meant they've had to spend more to retain associates and, of course, partners. I think also it caused them, and maybe this is a good thing, to focus really hard on their financial management, particularly at the elite end. I think the challenge of the elite US firms in the London market, which has already been high, is only going to grow. And I think law firms here in the UK, the bigger firms and the elite firms, are having to think very creatively about how they remain competitive for the most valuable and highest premium work.
Who wins in this race, Neville? Who's in the UK legal market? What's gonna happen?
Well, I think the larger firms, the elite firms, are performing at they're very successful businesses. The top 10 firms have net profit margins of 40% plus compared to the rest of the market in the 20s. So those are very successful businesses by any measure. And I think they'll continue to do well. And the recent merger of A&O and Sherman gives, I think, a real-life example of how those elite firms are seeking ways to compete more effectively on a global basis, but also strengthen their hand in the UK market. And I'm sure over time we'll see the other elite firms, also taking steps to ensure they remain competitive at that elite end of the market. But it's also worth noting, certainly here in the UK, that there have emerged over, say, the last 10 or 15 years, a category of boutique law firms, much smaller, but high quality. They tend to be staffed by partners and others from some of the very elite firms that have, for whatever reason, broken away to set up smaller shops. And some of those have been extraordinarily high performing. They continue to get very high quality work, compete at the elite level, but are much smaller organizations. And some of them are transatlantic, some of them are international in other ways. So I think what that has shown is that one doesn't have to be in a huge law firm to be successful. There is another model that can work. Where I expect there to be real challenges looking ahead the next 5 or 10 years is going to be with the mid-tier, because there the margins are much tighter. The pressure from new tech is going to be greater. And there's going to have to be some very, very creative thinking in the leadership and management of those firms to maintain their current business model. So, that's not a new point, but I think the pressures that there have been are just going to get more and more intense.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's certainly the same situation here, Neville, in the United States. Those firms that are kind of in this middle that we like to call it, similar to describing the elites. The elites are printing money. They're doing fine. They're hiring the best talent in the United States, giving the biggest paychecks. But there's all these firms that are in the middle that look and sound the same and have a lot of the same problems, some of the same wrestles of differentiation, keeping their talent, distinguishing themselves from everybody else. And that's causing consolidation. That's causing firms to combine, causing firms to close their doors, blow up in some ways here in the United States. It's happening. And it sounds like you guys are facing some similar realities.
Yes, I think so. And we do see some consolidation at the sort of smaller end of the market, not at the pace that people have predicted and been expecting based on those pressures that you've been describing. Mm-hmm. But it's hard to imagine that won't increase over time. I think, and there's another aspect to that point on consolidation as well, which receives hardly any attention amongst law firms in my experience, both in the UK and the US, and that is that all these firms invest in and maintain and spend a lot of money on their infrastructure and their business services to support the success of their lawyers and advising their clients. And it just seems to me that there is a very strong business case for many of these firms creating shared business services platforms which can benefit from scale economies and all the other benefits of scale and running those business services functions in a more effective way. It could be very helpful to firms in terms of maintaining their margins and continuing to invest in cutting edge technology and processes in all those back office services. But it seems firms are incredibly reluctant to consider that seriously. They just place huge value on having all of that in-house. So it'll be interesting to see that as economic pressure grows on their models, whether there's increased interest in doing that or not.
Well, it's that what you just described, Neville, that business model is happening in the United States. And it's happening on a small firm level, just for small firms as they're scaling. But it's happening a little bit on the larger level. There's an organization that just launched this year called Federate. And they are doing exactly what you said. They are providing everything a law firm needs, corporate law firm of pretty large scale. I mean, call it 100 headcount or more. Can easily. They can accommodate that. Where it's almost part of what they do is a lift out. They take the non-attorney management team and services, lift them out, and then charge the firm a fee on a headcount and provide that to a law firm that does what they want to do, practice law and be who they are. And so what you're describing, it's actually starting to happen. And there's other law firms here in town in the United States that have created that management service model. And just like physician firms and some other service organizations created that structure of managed services, have the professionals, the licensed professionals below, and then that's the managed service organization that's taking private equity. And that's how they're starting to see law firms very quietly here in the United States take private equity, and some partners are starting to take a little bit of the money off the table. And they're creating different incentive structures to hopefully keep them. But I think what you just described is happening here. I won't doubt that it's coming to the UK and other markets. And that's where private equity is going to start infusing firms with capital, like they have with medical practices in the United States, what's happening with the CPA firms in the United States. And that's going to create a very interesting legal environment.
Absolutely. I mean, that's fascinating and good to hear. The only model I'm aware of that's similar here in the UK is for new launches. In fact, it's Howard and I have had conversations about this particular service in the past, and they provide that shared services platform, but for new firm launches as opposed to existing firms. But that's something to watch without doubt, and as you say, can benefit from private equity investment.
Yeah, definitely.
And also, remember, at the same time that's happening, I'm based in New York, where every other day there is a new boutique practice that has sprung up out of nowhere, that has come from big law, dissatisfied with whatever management structure or whatever pay rate they were enjoying, and doing fantastically well in the marketplace just by, as you say, Neville, concentrating in a smaller, a smaller firm, practicing the craft, with obviously building their own rowboat and being very, very successful in the marketplace.
Yeah. Well, Neville, how can people find you, contact you, follow you on social media?
Well, people can find me on LinkedIn. That's probably the easiest route, Chris.
Wonderful. Well, Neville, it's been an honor and a pleasure. Really appreciate you carving some time out of your busy schedule talking to us across the pond. We appreciate your insights.
Not at all. It's been a great pleasure. Look forward to the next time. Thank you.
Thank you, Neville.
Thank you.